Ubisoft has entered one of the biggest crises in gaming history. After years of canceled games, layoffs, collapsing stock prices, and failed launches, the company behind Assassin's Creed, Far Cry, and Rainbow Six Siege is now fighting to survive. In January 2026, Ubisoft forecasted nearly €1 billion in operating losses. Their stock crashed more than 30% in a single day, hitting its lowest point in over 14 years, and somehow almost nobody outside the gaming industry is talking about it. But Ubisoft's downfall didn't happen overnight. This wasn't caused by one terrible game, and it wasn't just bad luck, because the real reason Ubisoft is losing everything started years ago. This started years before the layoffs ever happened, years before they released one of the most hated games in the AAA game industry, and long before investors started panicking as Ubisoft's stock and reputation began collapsing. The truth is that Ubisoft slowly lost the one thing that made people love the company in the first place, which is creativity. To understand how one of the biggest gaming companies in the world ended up here, you have to go back to when Ubisoft was at the top of the gaming industry. Back in the late 2000s and early 2010s, Ubisoft felt unstoppable. This was the era where the company constantly released games that felt ambitious, cinematic, and genuinely exciting. In 2007, Assassin's Creed released and immediately became one of the biggest new franchises in gaming. The parkour, historical settings, and scale made the game feel revolutionary. And then, in 2009, Ubisoft released Assassin's Creed 2. To many gaming enthusiasts, this was peak Ubisoft. The game's main character, Ezio, became one of gaming's most iconic protagonists. The world felt alive, and Ubisoft's reputation exploded. But Assassin's Creed wasn't the only reason people respected the company. Far Cry 3 released in 2012, and quickly became one of the most talked about games in the industry. The game's immersive open world, combined with the now iconic villain, Voss, helped push Ubisoft even further into the spotlight and solidified the company as one of the biggest names in AAA gaming. During this era, Ubisoft had built a reputation for making games that felt ambitious, creative, and genuinely exciting. Their releases felt like major events, and at E3 presentations, crowds would erupt whenever a new Ubisoft trailer appeared. And this wasn't just nostalgia talking either. Back then, Ubisoft genuinely helped define what modern open-world gaming looked like, and players trusted the company to consistently deliver something memorable. And most importantly, gamers actually believed Ubisoft cared about making great games. But looking back now, this was also the beginning of Ubisoft's biggest problem, because the formula that made Ubisoft successful would eventually become the thing that slowly destroyed the company. At first, Ubisoft's formula actually worked perfectly. Their games gave players huge open worlds to explore, packed with things to do. You could climb towers to reveal the map, clear enemy outposts, unlock skill trees, hunt collectibles, and spend dozens of hours inside a single game. Back in the early 2010s, players loved that style of design because it felt massive and immersive. But after a while, people started noticing a pattern. No matter what franchise Ubisoft released, the structure underneath always felt almost identical. The setting would change, the characters would change, but the gameplay loop stayed the exact same. Far Cry started feeling like Assassin's Creed with guns. Ghost Recon started borrowing the same systems. Watch Dogs began feeling like another version of the exact same checklist-driven open world. And slowly the excitement started turning into exhaustion. Maps became overloaded with icons. Games got bigger, but never really seemed to get better. Side missions started feeling repetitive, and players felt like they were doing the same activities over and over again, just in different locations. This is when online discussions started using the phrase, the Ubisoft formula. At first, it sounded like a compliment, but over time, it became one of Ubisoft's biggest reputational problems. Players criticized the company for repetitive gameplay, copy-paste objectives, bloated worlds, and focusing more on quantity than quality. The same design philosophy that once made Ubisoft successful was now starting to trap the company creatively. If you enjoy videos like this, please leave a like and subscribe. It helps us reach our goal of 1,000 subscribers. Thank you. Then came Assassin's Creed Unity in 2014, and for many people, this was the first major crack in Ubisoft's image. The launch was a disaster. The game was filled with bugs, broken performance, and glitches so ridiculous they instantly became internet memes. Characters loaded in without faces, NPCs broke constantly, and performance issues made the game frustrating to play. The backlash was massive, but more importantly, it damaged player trust. Gamers started feeling like Ubisoft cared more about releasing giant games every year than actually polishing them properly. And unfortunately for Ubisoft, this was only the beginning, because years later, the real damage would finally start showing. As the gaming industry started changing, Ubisoft changed with it. But instead of adapting through creativity, many players felt like the company started chasing trends. Around the late 2010s, live service games exploded in popularity. Battle passes were suddenly everywhere. Publishers became obsessed with engagement metrics, and the industry started focusing heavily on keeping players online for as long as possible. Ubisoft slowly moved in that direction too. This shift became especially noticeable in 2017 with Assassin's Creed Origins. Now, to be fair, a lot of players actually enjoyed Origins. The game reviewed well, and many people praised the new combat and RPG mechanics. But at the same time, it also represented a major turning point for Ubisoft's design philosophy. Their games were becoming more focused on long progression systems, level grinding, massive maps, and mechanics designed to stretch playtime for dozens or even hundreds of hours. And over time, many players started feeling like Ubisoft was moving away from what originally made their games feel special. Older Ubisoft games felt handcrafted. They felt focused. Modern Ubisoft games increasingly started feeling optimized. Not optimized for creativity, but for retention, monetization, engagement metrics, and player spending. You could see it in almost every release. XP boosters started appearing. Progression systems became slower and more grind-heavy. Worlds became enormous, but often filled with repetitive objectives that felt designed more to consume time than create memorable experiences. And eventually, a lot of players started feeling like Ubisoft games were being designed less by passionate developers and more by corporate analytics. For a while, the company was still making money, but something much more important was slowly disappearing in the background. By the early 2020s, Ubisoft's problems were no longer just about the games. Around this time, the company itself was starting to look unstable. In July 2020, major reports began exposing workplace misconduct and toxic leadership inside Ubisoft. Multiple executives were accused of serious issues involving harassment and abuse of power, and as public pressure grew, several high-ranking employees resigned. Almost overnight, Ubisoft's reputation took another massive hit. Before this, most criticism toward the company focused on repetitive game design and corporate trends. But now, people were questioning Ubisoft as a workplace and as a company overall. And behind the scenes, things only seemed to get more chaotic. In 2022, Ubisoft canceled several major projects, including Ghost Recon Frontline and Splinter Cell VR. On the surface, canceled games might not seem unusual since it happens across the industry all the time. But when large publishers suddenly start shutting down multiple projects back to back, it usually signals deeper internal problems. It became increasingly clear that projects were struggling, management was under pressure, and Ubisoft was having trouble finding direction. Then, in January 2023, the company publicly announced massive cost-cutting plans. Ubisoft stated that it was targeting around $230 million in reductions, while also canceling even more projects and restructuring development across the company. And for many players, this was the moment Ubisoft stopped looking like a confident industry leader. Now the company looked reactive, uncertain, and a little desperate. But Ubisoft's biggest disaster was still ahead, because eventually, one game would become the perfect symbol of everything people believed was wrong with modern Ubisoft. Few games represent Ubisoft's downfall better than Skull and Bones. When the game was first announced back in 2017, Ubisoft clearly wanted it to become their next huge live service success. The idea sounded promising at first, too. A large-scale pirate game focused on naval combat had massive potential, especially after so many players loved the ship mechanics in their other game, Assassin's Creed Black Flag. But almost immediately, development started going wrong. The game kept getting delayed over and over again. Years passed with very little excitement or momentum, and reports eventually claimed that the project had burned through hundreds of millions of dollars during development. And the longer people waited, the less interested they became. What once sounded ambitious slowly started turning into a joke across the gaming community. Then Ubisoft made the situation even worse. In an interview, a company executive referred to Skull and Bones as a quadruple A game, setting a huge expectation from the gaming community. And when gamers got their first look at the game, the internet instantly exploded with memes and backlash. Because when players looked at the gameplay footage, expecting to see some revolutionary next-generation experience, they saw another live service game filled with mechanics that already felt outdated before release. So when Skull and Bones finally launched on February 16th, 2024, the public reaction was extremely rough. Reviews were mixed, player numbers were disappointing, and online criticism was brutal. After nearly a decade of development, the game failed to create the excitement Ubisoft desperately needed. But the bigger problem was what the game represented. To many players, Skull and Bones became the perfect symbol of everything wrong with modern Ubisoft: a massive budget, endless delays, trend chasing, corporate decision-making, and a complete lack of creative energy. The game didn't feel like a passionate vision from developers. It felt like a product built by committee, designed around business trends instead of genuine innovation. And by this point, a lot of gamers had emotionally disconnected from Ubisoft entirely. Then came another major blow. On August 30th, 2024, Star Wars Outlaws was released. This was supposed to help restore confidence in the company. A massive open-world Star Wars game should have been one of the safest and easiest wins imaginable for a publisher like Ubisoft. But once again, the response felt disappointing. Reports suggested the game underperformed expectations, and many of the criticisms sounded painfully familiar. Players complained about repetitive systems, formulaic gameplay, and overly safe design choices that made the experience feel predictable instead of exciting. And after years of declining trust, failed launches, and growing criticism, Ubisoft was finally approaching the breaking point. By 2026, Ubisoft's situation had officially turned into a full-blown public crisis. For years, players had been criticizing the company's direction, but now the financial damage was becoming impossible to ignore. Ubisoft forecasted nearly $1.1 billion in operating losses, and investors reacted immediately. The company's stock collapsed by roughly 34% in a single day. Even worse, Ubisoft shares had now fallen more than 80% from their 2018 peak, dropping to levels the company hadn't seen in over 14 years. And at that point, the decline no longer felt theoretical. Now, it felt real. Ubisoft began announcing massive internal changes in an attempt to stabilize the company. Multiple games were canceled, several major projects were delayed, layoffs started happening, and the company reorganized parts of its structure into what it called creative houses. But instead of rebuilding confidence, these decisions made many people feel even more uncertain about Ubisoft's future. Investors started panicking, gamers were losing confidence in the company, and employees suddenly faced growing instability behind the scenes. The consequences of years of bad decisions had finally become impossible to ignore. And the most dangerous part for Ubisoft is that there doesn't seem to be one simple fix. Because Ubisoft didn't collapse overnight. The downfall happened slowly over many years. Repetitive game design slowly damaged player trust. Trend chasing weakened the company's identity. Corporate optimization gradually made the games feel less creative and more manufactured. And by the time the financial crisis finally arrived, many players had already emotionally disconnected from Ubisoft long before the stock price collapsed. But this is where the situation becomes much bigger than just Ubisoft, because Ubisoft isn't the only gaming company facing this problem. In many ways, Ubisoft's downfall reflects a much larger problem happening across the entire AAA gaming industry. Over the past decade, more and more major publishers have shifted their focus toward live service systems, engagement metrics, retention strategies, and monetization models designed to keep players spending money and staying online for as long as possible. And while those systems can be profitable, a lot of gamers have started feeling exhausted by them. That's why so many people today constantly talk about the old days of gaming. It's not necessarily because older games were objectively perfect. A lot of them had flaws too. But many players feel those games had something modern AAA titles are slowly losing. They felt more creative, focused, and personal. Games often felt like clear artistic visions made by developers who wanted to create memorable experiences, not products endlessly optimized around analytics and player retention. And for many gamers, Ubisoft became one of the clearest examples of what happens when a company slowly loses that feeling. That's why Ubisoft's decline feels strangely emotional to so many people online. Because to a lot of players, it doesn't just feel like a company failed. It feels like gaming itself changed. And for many fans, not necessarily for the better. Ubisoft once helped define modern gaming. For years, the company released some of the most ambitious and memorable games in the industry. But today, Ubisoft is struggling to survive inside an industry that no longer rewards the formula it built its empire on. And the real reason Ubisoft is losing everything isn't because of one bad game. It's because players slowly stopped believing the company cared about making great games in the first place. And once that trust disappears, it's nearly impossible to get back.